Hello and welcome back to the Nostalgic Network. My name is Aiden, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about pop culture in the 1930s and 1940s. So, if you don't know, this podcast is all about pop culture history, basically discussing pop culture trends from the past 100 years. But before we start, make sure to follow my Instagram, which is at the Nostalgic Network Podcast. And make sure to go check that out because I'll be posting updates on there about new episode releases and more stuff like that. And then also leave a follow on Spotify and make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, which will all be linked in my Instagram bio. So make sure to go look at that. So like I said before, this episode is about the 1930s and 40s pop culture. We'll be talking about their music, movies, sports, fashion, and much more. So to start off, we'll be talking about music. The 1930s had Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, and Judy Garland. The 1940s had Hank Williams, Bing Crosby, and Frank Sinatra, just to name a few. Some of the best musicians ever born thrived in the 30s. No one will ever forget the sweet sound of Louis Armstrong or the beautiful voice of Billie Holiday. Most people in the 30s didn't have television, but they did have radio. But this was different back then because radio had all kinds of things other than just music. They had stories, poetry, news, live music, variety shows, and much more. Sometimes the songs would be more popular than the original artists that wrote them. This is basically meaning that if they would drop a song, it wouldn't just become popular by that one person. It would be that if another artist re-recorded it to make their own version of it, then it could blow up from that artist. But people tended to focus more on the song rather than the artist who performed it. Because of this, the song would be more popular from multiple different artists. Music in the 1930s was usually more upbeat and relaxing. A lot of artists included humor in their songs. And the most popular genres were swing and jazz. The most popular artists were Billie Holiday, Glenn Miller, and Francis Day. Some of the most classic songs of the 30s were In the Mood, God Bless America, Over the Rainbow, Silent Night, Minnie the Moocher, Strange Fruit, and Stormy Weather. The 30s was also the era of big bands like orchestras. Moving on to the 40s, people listened to music on radio mostly, but phonograph players were just starting to get affordable for the average family. Radio stations censored a lot of the music that we enjoy listening to, that came out of the 1940s. And there was a lot of boycott that made the radio stations move almost entirely to talk format. It was a rough decade for music, but some of the most popular singers in the 1940s were a lot of singers from the 30s. But the list includes Billie Holiday, Bing Crosby, B. Wayne, Lead Belly, Lyle Anderson, Eddie Howard, and much more. Some of the most popular songs of the 40s were You Were Always the One by the Mills Brothers, Paper Doll, also by the Mills Brothers, Mañana by Peggy Lee, and Swingin' on a Star by Bing Crosby. Some of the most popular songs were To Teach His Own by Eddie Howard, Green Eyes by Jimmy Dorsey, and We Three by the Ink Spots, and a lot more too. Now, moving on from music, let's go ahead and talk about sports, because the 1930s was a very exciting time for sports. Like anything else, the Depression took a toll on sports. A lot of people took a salary cut and everyone was trying to make some extra cash. Also, a lot of the ballparks were suspended on renovations. In America, baseball was the most popular sport, but boxing came in second. But in 1930, Babe Ruth's salary was increased to $80,000, which was bigger than the president's salary, surprisingly, which was only about $75,000. Bill Terry led the National League with a .401 batting average, while Al Simmons led the AL with a .380 average. Hank Wilson led all major league hitters with a then NL record 56 home runs. Since and that was the most since by any player in either league. But Babe Ruth did hit 60 in 1927. Professional football club New York Giants defeated Notre Dame in a benefit game for the unemployment fund. Bronco Nagurski was a star player from the Chicago Bears. Chicago Cubs player Ernie Beers was another standout. College football All-Americans were led by Frank Corrido of Notre Dame and Leonard Macaluso. I hope I'm saying that right. But they were from Colgate. Alabama defeated Washington State 24-0 in the Rose Bowl, which was played on January 1st, 1931. Bobby Jones won the Grand Slam and then promoted promptly and retired. Interestingly, he made a wager that would accomplish this feat and reportedly won a $60,000 loan. Gallant Fox, ridden by jockey Sir Earl Sunday, won horse racing's most convected races en route to a Triple Crown victory. That was a tongue twister, I apologize. Now, Max Schmeling beat Jack Sharkey for the heavyweight title in front of an audience of 75,000 people. These names are tongue twisters, I'm telling you. So, in 1935 was a very special year for baseball because it ushered in the beginning of a nighttime baseball. On May 24th, Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was the president at the time, turned on the lights at Crossley Field for a game between the Reds and the Phillies in Cincinnati. It's difficult to explain the significance of this event, but let's just say it completely revolutionized baseball. Also, the boxing world was shaken by one of the most stunning upsets in sports history. James J. Braddock, with 24 losses to his name, defeated the world champion Max Baer to take the world title by a 15-round unanimous decision in New York. So moving on to the 1940s, of course, World War II had a huge impact on 1940 sports. Most of them were disrupted by the war, and the 1940 and 1944 Olympic Games were canceled because of the war. So during World War II, numerous athletes served in the armed forces until the end of the war. Some of them were Stan Musial, Warren Spahn, Ted Williams, Hank Greensburg, Bob Feller, and Joe DiMaggio, and much more. It is unfathomable that today's athletes would even think for 1 second about serving their country in this way. A major breakthrough occurred in 1946 when the Brooklyn Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson, the first African-American to play in Major League Baseball. Football wasn't really that popular yet, but there were professional leagues, of course. At that time, players were just still playing on both sides of the ball. The same goes for professional basketball. It was more of a novelty, but people really cheered on their hometown college basketball teams though. Boxing was hugely popular in the 1940s. And Joe Louis was one of the heavyweight champions for the entire decade. The only boxer to hold a crown for that long, which is surprising. Baseball, like all sports, was heavily impacted by World War II, of course. As of December 1st, 1943, 347 Major League players were serving in the armed forces, which is a huge number. Attendance numbers also went down, a total loss of 1,160,119 in comparison to 1942. Even with a loss of players and attendance, teams still played exceedingly well. The St. Louis Cardinals led the National League with a 105-49 record, finishing 18 games over second place Cincinnati. This was the largest first place lead since the 1906 Cubs won the league by a margin of 20 games. The New York Yankees won the American League pennant with a 98-56 record, finishing 6 games over second place Washington. By season's end, San Musigo led both leagues in the batting category with a batting average of .357, 108 runs, and 220 hits. Bill Nicholson, one of the Cubs, led the National League in home runs and runs batted in, with 29 HRs and 128 RBIs. However, the team did not go on to Wyoming University. The team did not go on postseason play, as all of the starters were in the armed forces of Wyoming University's. Wyoming, who run the Rocky Mountain Conference, went to win the NCAA tournament. Later, in a Red Cross benefit, Wyoming beat St. John's of Brooklyn, who had won the Madison Square Garden in Georgia. Dartmouth College won their conference for the 6th straight season, while Duke held their title in the South, though constantly bullied by George Washington. Rice and Texas shared the conference title in the Southwest, and Kentucky and Tennessee topped the Southeast. On the Pacific Coast, Washington stopped Stanford. Kansas won the Big Six, and Creighton dominated the Missouri Valley Conference. In the AAU, the Phillips 66 won the title in Denver, where it was hosted for the 9th time in a row. They beat the Denver Legion 57-40, and in the Army, Joe Lewis kept himself busy with boxing matches against others in the service. Billy Conn, a contender for the heavyweight title, was also in the Army. Championships in 4 divisions were frozen in 1943. The heavyweight, light heavyweight, middleweight, and welterweight. Willie Pep made one defense of his featherweight crown and held the title. But after his streak of 62 victories, one was broken. He enlisted in the Navy. Untouched by the war were the lightweight and bantamweight classes, I think that's how you say it. But the flyweight class is unmoved, dormant, as it has been for years. Jackie Patterson in Scotland, the title holder, had been all but unheard from. Manuel Ortiz, who shared possession of the featherweight title with Pep, defended his title no less than 8 times during 1943. At the time, this was the record for title defense, not even rivaled by Joe Louis, the most active boxer at the time. In the lightweight class, Boo Jack lost and regained his title in 1943 while drawing large crowds to his matches. So moving on from sports, we can now talk about the movies, and you may be wondering, what did people watch in the 30s? Well, this is the 1930s, and as you probably know, the 30s saw the release of the 2 most important and amazing films of all time, which are The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Also, some other popular ones were Frankenstein, San Francisco, Shanghai Express, Queen Christina, and Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Some of the most popular actors and actresses were Bette Davis, Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Frederick March, Mickey Rooney, Henry Fonda, Shirley Temple, and many more. Also, Walt Disney made his debut of Mickey Mouse during the 1930s, and as you can see, it has really blown up from there. So if you didn't know, before Mickey Mouse, Disney had the character Oswald, and Walt Disney and his team brainstormed to come up with a new cartoon character, a mouse named Mickey. And that is what became Mickey Mouse. And then Mickey first appeared in the two 1928 shorts, Plain Crazy and The Galloping Gaucho, which were not picked up for distribution before his public debut in Steamboat Willie, which came out in 1928. And if you don't know, Walt Disney's famous quote of how Disney got started is, "It all started with a mouse." Movies in the 1940s, like everything else at the time, were dominated by the war. However, instead of facing shortages like most people, the industry was well supported by the government thanks to its morale boosting qualities. That doesn't mean it didn't have to chip in. The movie industry ended up making training videos for the Army free of charge. The 1940s featured dozens of movies that were technological breakouts. Films like Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and The Grapes of Wrath enamor filmmakers to this very day. So Jimmy Stewart was a huge star in the 1940s. He was in It's a Wonderful Life, and it is one of the most moving performances ever. Some of the most popular movies were The Great Dictator, How Green Was My Valley, Yankee Doodle Dandy, Air Force, Coney Island, Meet Me in St. Louis, The Valley of Decision, Song of the South, The Egg and I, Red River, and much more. Some of the most popular actors and actresses were James Stewart, Vincent Price, Hedy Lamarr, Rita Hayworth, Veronica Lake, and many more. So, moving on from movies, let's talk about fashion. So, fashion in the 1930s was just as glamorous as the 1920s, just in a different way. Men still dressed up nice, spotting fedoras and double-breasted overcoats. The boys wore shorts, and tall socks. The women wore dresses and kept their hair close to their head. Fur was in, and so were floral patterns. Makeup was chic, and shoulder pads were very important until the late 1930s. Although hats were still popular for women, they were gradually becoming less popular. One way to tell if something is from the 30s is if it has initials engraved or stitched. This was a common free service that stores offered. Moving on to the 1940s. So what did people wear in the 40s, you might ask? Well, men were still pretty dressed up. Suits and ties and hats were commonplace in public. And women wore dresses and skirts. But they still didn't wear slacks yet. Another thing, women always wore gloves. Preferably a pair that matches their outfit. Fur was very popular, as were animal skins and crocodile purses, wombat collars, lambskin lining, and leather sleeves. No animal was off limits. Clothes in the 40s were very bright and colorful. The brighter the better. And women's shoes were often one of the popular choices, red, white, or blue. Alright, so that is going to be it for today's episode. I really hope y'all enjoyed this one, even though it is only the second episode. But in the next episode, we'll talk about the 50s and 60s and maybe even the 70s, but we'll have to see depending on how long it'll be. But it'll basically talk about rock and roll and Elvis, the Beatles, and all that good stuff. So stay tuned for that because it should be a good one. But also make sure to follow the Instagram at the Nostalgic Network Podcast once again. And also make sure to follow the Spotify and subscribe to the YouTube. Once again, thank you for listening. And I hope you guys have a great day or night, whatever you're listening. Anyways, I will see you all later.